Hi everyone, this is Mike Healy, and I'm going to be walking through my research proposal, which is focused on pay-as-you-throw trash systems. Before I get into the meat of the proposal itself, I thought it would be a good idea to just take a quick minute to review what pay-as-you-throw actually is. PAYT is predicated on a very simple concept. The more trash you create, the more you should pay for its removal. There are three main types of PAYT. One's a bag program. This is where bags are purchased directly from local governments, and these bags can only be used in trash collection. A variation on this is a can program. You decide what size canister you want to purchase, and quite naturally the larger canisters will cost more, the smaller canisters will cost less. And finally, you have hybrid programs. These are the most commonly found throughout the country, and for the most part, they follow a freemium model. You can dispose of a certain amount of trash for free, but if you produce trash beyond that certain amount, you'll need to start paying for all that additional trash removal. So next, I'd like to take a look at the geographic distribution of PAYT. As you can see here, looking at this map, there are very concrete concentrations of where PAYT has been implemented, and this really feeds into the reason I wanted to research PAYT. This is not a random phenomenon. You can see here that PAYT is being implemented in very distinct areas, I think for very distinct reasons, and I wanted to research what those reasons are. So on to my research questions, and I have two of them. They're really focused on looking at aspects of communities and how those aspects affect PAYT before implementation and after implementation. So I'm looking at 5 key pre-existing factors that exist in communities. They are political divisiveness, political and popular support for environmental causes, financial health, population size, and the prevalence of PAYT systems in surrounding areas. And what I want to know is this: how do these 5 factors affect prospects for PAYT implementation and the success of PAYT implementation? And the second question is, how do these factors affect PAYT results after implementation? So do these 5 factors do the presence or absence of these 5 factors cause PAYT to be more or less successful in implementation? And do they also produce better or worse results after implementation? So now a brief literature review of PAYT. Much of the PAYT literature is dedicated to building support. This literature is very practical in nature. It's really targeted towards potential PAYT implementers, focusing on real-life strategies for garnering buy-in from communities and from local legislatures. Then we have results examination, and I should say that almost across the board, PAYT acts as a boon and invariably increases recycling, decreases trash, and decreases the amount of money that governments need to spend on trash removal. PAYT really is a very efficient system of trash removal in almost every instance. And finally, we have relating stories. There are regional issues with PAYT. In more rural areas, you need to worry about animals coming and picking trash apart. In urban areas, you need to make sure that the trash haulers can quickly identify adherence to a PAYT program. Is this the correct canister or the correct bag? So there are different regional issues. The community's socialization to trash will also affect their buy-in, the community's pre-existing attitudes to recycling. That will reflect how easy it is to get their buy-in as well. Now, 2 things that you won't find well researched in the literature include failures and pre-existing factors. Well, let me speak to failures first. To be quite honest, PAYT failure is quite rare. And to add to that, failure is not very clear-cut. A legislature will almost never opt to vote down a PAYT proposal outright. Failures are a bit obfuscated because it is not an instance of an implementing government denying or blocking PAYT outright. They use other tactics to stop or delay the implementation of PAYT. The failures that do occur most commonly happen as recalls after PAYT has actually been implemented. There's not much academic research on these recalls. It's really only literature of a journalistic nature, and this is a major impediment to my research design. Rather than looking at what went wrong, I need to focus on what went right and look at PAYT implementation successes, because the body of failures is so small and the literature dedicated to these failures is even smaller. The other area that is not well documented in the literature relates to my specific research questions. Almost no systematic research has been done in an effort to identify what the PAYT-leaning communities are, what aspects of these communities lend themselves to implement PAYT, and why these aspects are important. What is the relationship between the features of these communities and this non-traditional trash system? The need for case study comes from these 5 pre-existing factors that I'm looking at. I arrived at these 5 factors logically because I personally think that they would have an effect on PAYT success. I can make logical extensions from the existence of those factors and the presence of PAYT. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm not looking at the right variables? Well, that's what the case study is hopefully going to determine. I want to do a case studies in 2 different cities. One of them is San Francisco, and San Fran is really a paragon of ecological progressivism and trash efficiency. They implemented PAYT a few years ago, and it was a huge success. They currently have 77% waste diversion. That 77%, it's the highest in the United States. As if that's not enough, San Francisco has a target of 0 waste disposal by 2020. So quite clearly, they're very forward-thinking, they're very environmentally focused. San Francisco is really a great place to see why PAYT is a success, why PAYT works, how it works, what attitudes in the community lend themselves to PAYT success. And to contrast this, I want to look at Sanford, Maine. Sanford is a community that also implemented PAYT, but then later recalled it. So here is an instance of where PAYT did not work. Again, there was some initial optimism. PAYT was actually implemented, but it was found so repulsive by the community that they took action, and that the legislature ultimately recalled the PAYT program. So here's going to be an opportunity to look at PAYT from the other end. What doesn't work well? What causes PAYT to be a failure? So this dichotomy here I think is really important. I think these case studies are really important to make sure that I'm on the right track, that I'm looking at the right things, and that I'm considering the most important factors that affect PAYT success or failure. So now I'll move on to sampling. Random sampling will not work for my targeted variables. To be sure, a random sample will speak to how prevalent my 5 pre-existing factors are, but they're not going to speak to how effective they are in achieving implementation and in generating positive post-implementation results. That's actually a pretty fine distinction that I'm making here, and I'm going to reiterate it. I'm not looking at how prevalent my 5 pre-existing factors are in successful PAYT implementations. Instead, I'm trying to see how effective those factors are in garnering PAYT success. So if I only do a random sample, I'll be assessing the wrong thing. I'll be seeing how common those factors are in PAYT communities, but it will say nothing about causality and effectiveness of PAYT success. I need to create a sample that's grounded in theory. Now, I spoke to that just now a little bit. I arrived at my 5 pre-existing factors logically. So I want to test those factors as best I can, and here's my plan. I'm going to collect 100 communities for each of these 5 pre-existing factors, and each set of 100 will include a range of variability. So for my 100 communities that I collect for political divisiveness, there's going to be a range from not at all divisive to extremely divisive communities. And I'm using the number 100 because it's round, it's convenient. This number may need to increase because, again, as we've discussed earlier in the semester, confidence is important. I want to make sure I'm at a 95% confidence level, so it's just something to be aware of. I would now like to address measurement, but there are really only 2 of my 5 variables that require an operationalized approach to measurement. Finances, population size, and the prevalence of PAYT systems in surrounding areas. These 3 pre-existing factors are all innately quantifiable. They're all easily quantifiable. I'm really not going to speak too much to them. The 2 items that do require some discussion regarding measurement are political divisiveness and environmental attitudes. And I'm going to take the same approach for both of these. For each of these factors, I've identified 4 subvariables. And what my intention is to measure each of these 4 subvariables in all of my communities and compare them to national averages. For political divisiveness, if a community is above the national average for all 4 subvariables, it will be deemed extremely political divisive. If it's above average for 3, it will be deemed very politically divisive. If it's deemed above average, if it's above average for 2 of the subvariables, it will be deemed somewhat politically divisive. And if it's above average for 1 or none of these subvariables, it will be deemed not at all politically divisive. And I will do the same for environmental attitudes, breaking it up into these 4 categories. So let me give a discussion to these subvariables. For political divisiveness, I want to look at spending closeness between electoral candidates, strength of party identification among voters, share of party representation in legislative and executive branches, and policy gridlock. I think all 4 of these will be very telling to determine how politically divisive a community actually is. For environmental attitudes, I'm following the EPA's lead. The EPA has identified these 4 items: air quality, energy production and conservation, percentage of green buildings and green space, amount of recycling, and the amount of available public transportation as measures that are indicative of the environmental consciousness of a community. So bottom line is, if it's good enough for the EPA, it's good enough for me. Again, I'm going to measure each of these 4 subvariables for political divisiveness and environmental attitudes, apply them to the communities in my sample, and then categorize a community in one of 4 ways: extremely, very, somewhat, or not at all politically divisive or environmentally conscious. One more thing I'd like to say about measurement, and that's measuring success. I've been throwing that term around a lot in this proposal, so I just want to spend a minute to codify that. In the implementation context for the first of my research questions, I'm taking a very simplistic review to success. If a community implements PAYT legislation, that is deemed a success. On the results context, it's a little bit more complex. Throughout the literature, researchers identify 3 key determinants in measuring the efficacy of PAYT, and that is overall waste reduced, amount of waste diverted from landfills, and increases in recycling. So those 3 items are going to be how I define results success. So just to briefly recap where we are, I've posed my initial research questions, which hinge on my 5 pre-existing factors. These are the independent variables for the research. I have engaged in case studies to make sure that these variables are in fact relevant to the research questions. I've created a sample wherein these variables actually vary, and I have codified a measurement for two of the variables. At this point, I'm going to have to go out into the world and collect data. I'm going to have to get all of the data on my sample of 500 communities on these 5 pre-existing factors. I'm also going to need to collect data on the results of PAYT in these 500 communities. And again, these are going to be the results that I just spoke to, the amount of the changes in recycling, the overall waste reduced, and the amount of waste diverted from landfills. Once I have all of this data, it's time for analysis. And to analyze the data, I'm going to engage in regression for both of my research questions. So here are just some sample outputs of that regression analysis. And as you can see here, the instances of PAYT success, that is our dependent variable. Our independent variable is on the x-axis here, and I'm just showing one of them, a measure of political divisiveness. And these are not actual results. This is just something I've put together to show as a sample, but you could ostensibly presume that as political divisiveness decreases and moves to the left, PAYT success would increase, and that's exactly what this regression line shows. If you look at the next sample output here, I'm doing the same thing, but for environmental conscience. Again, presumably the more ecologically and environmentally aware a community is, the more likely that community will successfully implement PAYT. Again, that's just an assumption. This is not based on actual results, but just to show you what my intended outputs would be for my data analysis. So looking at cost, benefits, and challenges, the main cost driver for my research proposal is going to be the case studies. In order to gather information and see what these PAYT implementations were really all about, I'm going to have to spend some sustained time in the field. That naturally is going to drive up costs. A benefit can be found in data collection. All of the data that I'm looking at are from freely available sources or relatively inexpensive sources. I'm going to be looking at EPA databases, the U.S. Census, and for information on political divisiveness, I'm going to be tapping into the urban mayoral election study. A challenge on data collection is that I need to collect so much. My sample is going to consist of 500 communities, but I'm going to have to look at many more PAYT implementing communities just to find the right 500. I do want the 500 cases I assemble to show variability in the 5 variables I'm looking at. So that's going to take a lot of time, and I'm going to need to look at many different cases of PAYT implementation. A final challenge I want to address is the general newness of PAYT. PAYT has only gained popularity in the last 10 or 15 years, so there's a general cloudiness as to the overall understanding of what makes PAYT tick, the literature surrounding PAYT. As I've discussed, there are some gaps there, mostly journalistic in nature, so the fact that PAYT is sort of a new phenomenon is definitely a fundamental challenge to my research proposal, in that this kind of research has not been done very much before, and as such has not been fully operationalized. So now we come to the conclusion and the real question here, which is, why bother implementing this proposal? Well, first let me say that PAYT is almost universally a boon for implementing communities. Trash production is decreased, recycling is increased, pressure on landfills is eased up, and very importantly, PAYT is cheap. Almost universally, PAYT will free up financial resources for state and local governments. So because PAYT so commonly has these positive effects, by engaging in this study, we can equip PAYT implementers with the information they need to identify communities with a high likelihood of success and a low likelihood of success. For instance, if there are communities with the pre-existing factors that make them unfavorable to PAYT implementation, those implementers may need to dedicate more resources to better outreach. They may need to have a better plan for education and support building. On the other side of the coin, if implementers are looking for new areas to expand PAYT, they can find communities that have the pre-existing factors that would make them more amenable to PAYT implementation, and that would allow for a speedy spread of PAYT to new communities. Another reason to implement this proposal is to fill in a gap in the literature. As I've said before, almost no research has been dedicated to these aspects of PAYT, to looking at the pre-existing factors in communities, that demographic information, those 5 factors that I outlined previously, and seeing how those pre-existing factors have a relationship with PAYT success or failure in implementation and in results. So really looking at what's existing from a demographic and from a political standpoint before implementation, and seeing how those traits that are ingrained in the communities affect PAYT success. Finally, I'm hoping to, in some way, generalize to a larger question, which is what causes local legislatures to implement non-traditional policies? Of course, PAYT has only gained popularity in the last couple decades. It's a generally new, non-traditional policy. So why would state and local legislatures, who are so commonly associated with not being interested in anything non-traditional, who are mostly interested and have historically been associated with not breaking the mold, why would they engage in something like PAYT? And why would they be in favor of something like PAYT? Is it solely financially focused? If there's a financial boon for them, will that garner their buy-in? Is it based on the demands of their constituencies? Is it something else completely, or is it a mix of factors? So I'm hoping that because I've been so rigorous in my sampling, even though I took a theory-based approach to the sample, I hope in some way that the study will be generalizable, and in some tangential way the study will be able to speak to the question, why do local governments engage in non-traditional policy making?